First and foremost, my sincere thanks and gratitude to Hedayah for the invitation and the opportunity to present. So indeed, Fenissa, you alluded to this, a bit of a sensitive topic. So why did I decide to start a research on this topic? First, maybe some elements of context to illustrate the relevance of the so-called migration-terrorism nexus. You can think of recent attacks earlier this year committed by asylum seekers in Europe, in France, Germany, or Austria, for instance. You can think of anti-immigration riots in the UK or in Netherlands earlier this year as well, that sort of spilled over into violent extremist acts, and even some acts prosecuted as terrorist acts. And you can also think, for instance, outside of Europe, about, for instance, recent calls in propaganda by IS, by the Islamic State, to call their sympathizers to migrate, for instance, towards West Africa, for instance, towards Libya, including presenting Libya as a gateway to Europe. So that's just for recent elements of context. But also, I think an important reason for looking into this is that every time you want to look into the migration-terrorism nexus, there is an oscillation between, on the one hand, a tendency to exaggerate the threat, or even, let's be honest, to instrumentalize the threat, presenting every migrant as a security threat. Spoiler alert, that's not the case. And on the other hand, a bit of an approach that this would be a taboo topic. It's too sensitive, it's too dangerous, it plays in the hands of those who instrumentalize this nexus, so therefore we should not even talk about it. I cannot agree with that, with either of these two extremes. I do see that migration and terrorism issues intersect. I do see that these issues interact. And as a researcher, as a policy-oriented researcher, I think we must try to understand this nexus because we need to inform better policy responses. So indeed, I will present some findings from a report that we published earlier this year by the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, ICCT, which I co-authored with Meryl de Monk, who was a research fellow at ICCT and is now in other functions in France. In terms of method, very quickly, I will not bother you, but in that report, which is quite lengthy, we did an extensive literature review of all the academic and grey literature that focused on any kind of connections between migration and terrorism issues. We did 3 in-depth case studies we call post-mortem, so we analyzed in-depth 3 terrorist attacks in Europe that had a strong migration nexus into it to draw some conclusions, but also to see what immigration and counterterrorism services drew as conclusions from these attacks. And we also built a data set of terrorist incidents, which I will also present. In total, we reviewed over 200 books, reports, and articles for the literature review. And in a nutshell, these are the very brief conclusion before I go a little bit into more details about what the literature has to say. But first and foremost, terrorism can be a cause, but also a consequence of migration. I think that will not be a surprise to many of you. Also, quite importantly and interestingly, terrorist organizations purposefully, consciously seek to exploit migration for propaganda purposes, for recruitment purposes, for radicalization purposes, for financing purposes, and also for operational purposes. More on this in a minute. Overall, there is a consensus in the literature that migrants are much more likely to be victims than perpetrators of terrorism. I think that's something that sounds intuitive to a lot of us, but this is something that is healthy to be reminded every now and then. So I will further explore or highlight 2 key aspects that the literature has told us. On the one hand, terrorism as a source or vector of migration, and then I will also look at migration as a source of vector of terrorism. So in this regard, terrorism as a source of migration, Think of basically people emigrating outside of a particular country to flee basically terrorism and terrorist violence. Think of course, what happened in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Somalia. Examples abound. This immigration triggered by terrorist violence can be, of course, incidental, but it can also be a deliberate strategy of terrorist groups. There's a number of terrorist groups who purposefully, consciously try to trigger immigration to cleanse and take control of territory, to put pressure on neighboring states, etc., etc. There's also cases where immigration can be an indirect consequence of terrorism. Rather, see terrorism in a broader picture of conflict, sluggish economy, lack of job opportunities, which basically encourage people to move to other places. And also, there is a whole strand of literature looking at heavy-handed counter-terrorism approaches, or what some people call even state terrorism, that also trigger immigration and persecution. Think of examples in Syria, in China, in Russia, Ukraine, for instance. The other side of the equation is migration as a source or as a vector of terrorism. That's the one we think more intuitively when we discuss this phenomenon. And there's various dimensions to it, and I think the review of the literature is very helpful to map out all these different dimensions. You can think of terroristic use of migration flows, for instance, for operational purposes. Think of how, for instance, major attacks in Europe were perpetrated by individuals who re-entered Europe using migration flows, posing as asylum seekers, even though they were not asylum seekers. These were EU citizens or EU residents. That's a phenomenon that is extremely rare statistically, if you look at the number of attacks committed by asylum seekers compared to the number of asylum seekers in Europe, but it is something that has happened nonetheless. And it is something that intelligence services still warn might still be happening. For instance, ISKP recent attempts to enter Europe through migration flows. The other side of it is basically terrorists emigrating towards other places to actually join a terrorist organization or perpetrate a terrorist act, and think of Europe as an exporter of terrorists with the context or with the phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters, which we have all been working or followed very extensively over the past years. There is also the dimension of radicalization and recruitment among migrant communities, asylum seekers, or refugees. And it's quite important in this case in the literature to highlight that this radicalization and recruitment can occur throughout the migration process, so during transit, in camps, or in reception centers. There are different cases, different illustrations along all of the migration path. And this radicalization and recruitment can be voluntary, that is to say people radicalizing and consciously joining a terrorist organization, but it can also be coerced. There's quite a number of examples of coerced recruitment into terrorist organization by terrorist actors. But also what the literature highlights in this case, and that's something that will be familiar to a lot of you, is that it's very, very difficult to exactly pinpoint when the radicalization process started. So therefore, that's a major caveat or major gap in the literature. We don't always know when the radicalization really started and whether it started during the migration, before or after arriving in the host country. There's also a whole lot of literature on the role of diaspora, on the crime, migration, terrorism nexus. I will not have the time to look into this. But finally, there's also literature. It's much scarcer, and that's something that we would like to see more. But there is a bit of a literature on migrants and migrant communities as targets of terrorism, which is, again, something for which we lack proper data, we lack research, and I would encourage people to do more research on this aspect. There are other aspects in this literature review that I'm not going to touch upon here. Again, you can find the report online, because what I want to do now very quickly is to tell you or share with you the findings also from our data set. So we did build for our study a data set that basically collected all jihadi terrorist attacks, completed terrorist attacks, not full terrorist attacks, where there was a migration nexus present. So that is to say, attacks committed by asylum seekers, immigrants, first generation, or by individuals posing as migrants or asylum seekers, which is an important nuance. We focused on attacks committed only in the EU in the period 2014-2024. So just flagging, this is looking only at a very narrow angle of the migration-terrorism nexus, but we wanted to see what happens if we look at this, because that's basically what politicians instrumentalize the most. That's what's most frequently discussed in the media. So we really wanted to look at what the data actually has to say about this. And very briefly, our data then is this. So we found 43 attacks committed by 55 individuals in the period 2014-2024 in Europe. You can see a clear spike in the period 2015-2017. That's not surprising. That's when the majority of terrorist attacks in Europe occurred. But importantly, it's mostly linked to EU nationals, and I'll come back to this in a second. Otherwise, the trend is fairly stable. And the other aspect of this data that is interesting is this. The majority of the 55 perpetrators were either born in Europe, EU citizens, or had been present and residing in Europe for more than 5 years, some of them more than 10 years. So that is to say, they radicalized in Europe, or they were Europeans, simply, that re-entered Europe using migration flows. Only 24%, 14 individuals of our sample were irregular migrants, such as, for instance, asylum seekers who were denied asylum in Europe. The rest, EU citizens, permanent residents, official stay permit, people that had been in Europe for, again, a very long time. So what are the implications of this data? Well, as far as we can tell from our data, the phenomenon is not rising in spite of what you can regularly hear or read in the media. It's not insignificant, 43 attacks, 55 individuals, it's not insignificant. We should not deny the challenge. Security services sometimes raise this issue as well. I've mentioned also IS propaganda, I've mentioned ISKP attempts. You can look also at the numbers of individuals that are being monitored by security services. You have a ratio of 20 to 30% of individuals that have a no national passport and a smaller proportion, usually around 5 to 10%, that are in an irregular situation. So it is there, but it's a small fraction. It's only a small fraction of the terrorist picture. Overall, it is much more complex than migrants are the problem. Irregular migrants are just a small part of this phenomenon. It is wrong to focus on them exclusively, and immigrants are more likely to radicalize in Europe rather than come to Europe to commit an attack. And that is because we all know that terrorism is mainly a domestic and homegrown problem, which is confirmed again by many studies. I'm reaching the end of my time, so just to conclude, I want to emphasize that migration and terrorism issues do interact, they do intersect, so it is clearly justified to work on this topic, but also this relationship is multidirectional and multidimensional. So more research is needed to support evidence-based policies, domestically and internationally. We have identified a number of knowledge gaps and recommendations. I'm not going to go through it because I don't have the time. You can see that that's only a fraction of it. We have many more knowledge gaps and recommendations in the report. So if you're looking for research topics, or if you have PhD students looking for research topics, feel free to tap into this. And otherwise, this is the QR code to access the report. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.